In all spheres this has implied the basic progress of knowledge, namely that the qualitative weighing of objects one with another, which always remains a relatively uncertain and inexact process, is transferred to a quite unambiguous quantitative process in which a universal internal unit is secured in the objects. This unit is universally the same and self-evident and no longer has to be considered in the calculation of the relative importance of individual elements. From the socialist standpoint, this is clearly a mere extension and consequence of the attempt to reduce all values as a whole to the economic sphere as their starting point and their substance. Such an attempt must necessarily follow from this standpoint if its leveling tendency is thought out to its conclusion. For in the economic sphere one can at least conceive of an equality of individuals as being possible. In all other spheres, the intellectual, emotional, character, aesthetic, ethical, etc., the quality of the means of labor is, from the very outset, hopeless. If, nonetheless, one wishes to undertake this task, then there is no other possibility than to somehow reduce these interests and qualities to that which alone permits an approximate uniformity of distribution. I am well aware that present-day scientific socialism rejects mechanical communist egalitarianism and merely wishes to establish an equality of conditions of work out of which the diversity of talent, strength and effort would also lead to a diversity of position and satisfaction. Despite the present situation in which hereditary descent, class distinction, the accumulation of capital and all the possible chances of economic opportunities produce much greater corresponding distances than do individual differences in activities, this would, in fact, mean not only a basic equalization in every respect but also the equalization of the elements of ownership and satisfaction which seem to me today still to be the genuine effective means of agitation for the masses. If historical materialism is made the scientific demonstration of the socialist doctrine, then what is of concern here, as so often, is the systematic construction of the path that is the reverse of that of the creative movement of thought. Therefore socialist theory has not been logically derived from the independently established historical materialism, rather, the practically established socialist-communistic tendency must furthermore first produce the only base that is possible for it. It must declare economic interests to be the source and common denominator of all others. Once this has taken place, however, the same tendency in the economic sphere must itself then be pursued, and the diversity of its contents reduced to a unity which, over and above all individual achievements, asserts the possibility of an equalization and an externally verifiable equitableness. Differences in types of labor as quantitative differences. For the assertion that the value of all valuable objects rests upon their labor costs still does not suffice for this purpose. It would still be possible to unify the qualitative diversity of labor in such a manner that a smaller amount of higher labor formed a similar or higher value to a considerably larger amount of lower labor. In so doing, however, a completely different scale of value would be introduced than the one considered here. The decisive qualities of specialization, intellectuality and complexity would certainly still be produced both with and in labor, but would be realized as a mere attribute of that labor. Yet the element of value itself would rest no longer upon labor as labor but upon the order of qualities constructed according to a quite independent principle for which labor as such, which is the general element of all labor qualities, would still be only the irrelevant agent. In this way, the labor theory would be confronted with the same dilemma that underlies the doctrines of moral philosophy, namely that the production of happiness is the absolute ethical value. That is, if trade is really moral to the extent that it results in happiness, then this means a breakdown of principle and the introduction of new specific elements of value if the purer, more intellectual, more exclusive happiness is priced as being the more valuable. For then one could conceive of the situation in which such happiness, though quantitative, i.e. considered as mere happiness, would be less than that of a lower, sensuous, selfish happiness, despite the fact that the former would be morally more worth striving for. The ethical theory of happiness is therefore consistent only when all the ethical distinctions between moral and intellectual, Epicurean and ascetic, egotistic and altruistic happiness in the last instance all accompanying and related phenomena are taken into account as the mere quantitative distinctions of one and the same, qualitatively always the same type of happiness. Equally, a consistent labor theory must be able to sustain the view that all the unambiguously experienced and indisputable value distinctions between two achievements that appear both as labor-extensive and intensive only means, in the last instance, that more labor is concentrated in the one than in the other, that only a first and fleeting glance would take them to be the same amounts of labor, but that a deeper penetrating view actually reveals more or less labor as the basis of their greater or lesser value. In fact, this interpretation is not as deficient as it at first sight appears to be. One need only interpret the concept of labor widely enough. Firstly, if one views labor solely with reference to its individual agents, then it is evident that in some higher labor product it is in no way the case that only that amount of labor is invested in it that can be directly applied to this particular product. Rather, the whole prior efforts without which the present relatively easier production would be impossible must be included in the calculation on a pro rata basis as labor necessary for its production. Of course, the work of a musical virtuoso at an orchestral concert is often less in relation to its economic and ideal assessment. However, the situation is completely different if one includes in the calculation the efforts and the extent of the preparation as the precondition for the immediate performance of this amount of labor. Thus, in countless other instances of higher labor, a form of more labor is implied. Yet this does not lie in the sensory perceptibility of momentary exertion but rather in the condensation and accumulation of previous achievements and the present performance of exertions so conditioned, in the playful ease with which the master solves his tasks an infinitely greater labor effort can be embodied than in the sweat that the bungler must shed in order to perform a much lower task. However, this interpretation of the qualitative distinctions of labor as quantitative ones can be extended to the merely personal preconditions. For certainly this interpretation is inadequate for reducing, in the specified manner, those qualities of labor that gain their high estimation through an inherited gift or through the goodwill of the objective preconditions that offer themselves. At this point, one must make use of a hereditary hypothesis which of course, here as elsewhere, where it specifically enters into inherited qualities, only offers a very general line of thought. If we were to accept the enlarged explanation of instinct, namely that it emerges out of the accumulated experiences of ancestors, that these have led to specific efficient coordinations of nerves and muscles and are inherited in this form by the offspring in such a manner that for them the efficient effect upon the necessary nervous stimulation results purely mechanically and without requiring their own experience and practice. If we were to accept this explanation, then one could view the particular inborn inheritance as an especially fortuitous instance of instinct. This example is one in which the accumulation of such physically assimilated experiences resolutely results in a specific direction and in such a stratification of the elements that the slightest disturbance calls forth a fruitful interaction of important and efficient functions. The fact that a genius needs to learn so much less than the average person for a similar achievement, that a genius knows things that they have not experienced, this wonder seems to indicate an exceptionally full and easy impressive coordination of inherited energies. If one traces this inheritance sequence far enough back and makes clear that all experiences and accomplishments within the same series can be gained and developed further only through real labors and through practicing, then the individual distinctiveness of the genius's achievement also appears as the condensed result of the work of generations. The well-endowed person would, consequently, be the one in whom a maximum of his predecessor's work is accumulated in a latent form that is designed for further accumulation.